6:56 a.m., March 19th, 1940. The first bucket locked into place with a metallic click that Gerald Mitchell felt more than heard over the roar of flooding seawater. His hands moved to the second bucket in the assembly, fingers finding the deployment clips through muscle memory he'd practiced 100 times in secret. The rubber gasket, cut from a discarded Jeep tire, compressed against the torn hull plating, and something impossible happened. The water flow decreased, not stopped, not sealed, but the violent geyser forcing its way through the 18-foot gash in USS Franklin's port side suddenly dropped from a ship-killing torrent to something the pumps might actually handle. Mitchell deployed the third bucket, then the fourth, each one creating a baffle that redirected the pressure instead of fighting it head-on. Jesus Christ! It's working, Fireman Yancey breathed behind him. Mitchell, it's actually working! The full bucket array took 7 minutes to deploy. 7 minutes of waist-deep water, freezing cold, hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. When Mitchell locked the final cable wire into place and stepped back, the flooding had been reduced by 70%. Not eliminated, the ocean was still winning, but now it was a fight the ship could survive. Lieutenant Commander Harris, the damage control officer who'd called Mitchell's idea the stupidest waste of materials I've ever seen, appeared through the smoke like a ghost. His khaki uniform was soaked, his face blackened with soot from the hangar deck fires above. He stared at the bucket assembly for a long moment, then at Mitchell. "Seaman," Harris said quietly. "What the hell is that?" "Pressure baffle system, sir," Mitchell replied, still catching his breath. "Uses the ship's forward momentum to create counterflow instead of—" "I don't care about the physics," Harris interrupted. "Can you do it again?" Mitchell looked at the officer, understanding flooding through him faster than the seawater had. There were other breaches, smaller ones maybe, but still flooding compartments throughout the ship. "Yes, sir, if I have materials and hands to help." Harris grabbed the ship's phone mounted on the bulkhead. "DC Central, this is Harris. I need every bucket on this ship, all the rubber gasket material we have, and every spare cable wire. Send it to frame 72, port side. And get me a runner to find Seaman Mitchell's locker. Apparently, he's got more of these assemblies already built." He hung up and looked at Mitchell with something between respect and fury. "You built backups?" "6 complete systems, sir," Mitchell admitted. "Been working on them for 3 months." 3 months. Harris's jaw tightened. "You've had a solution to hull breach flooding for 3 months, and you didn't tell anyone?" "I tried, sir. You told me to stop wasting everyone's time." The silence between them was broken by another shudder through the ship's frame. A secondary explosion from somewhere deep in the hangar bay. The bucket array held. Water continued flowing through the breach, but at a rate the pumps could match. USS Franklin was still dying, but she was dying slower now. "After this is over," Harris said, "you and I are going to have a long conversation about the chain of command." He paused. "But right now, you're going to teach every damage control team on this ship how to build your stupid bucket system. Because if it can save this compartment, maybe it can save the whole damn ship." Mitchell nodded. "Aye, sir." As Harris moved off to coordinate the response, Yancey stepped beside Mitchell, staring at the buckets holding back the Pacific Ocean. "You know they're either going to give you a medal or court-martial you for this, right?" Mitchell allowed himself a small smile. "Right now, I'll settle for staying afloat." Gerald Mitchell's childhood was built from salvage and necessity. Born in 1923 in Harlan County, Kentucky, he grew up in a world where the Depression wasn't an economic event, it was just the way things were. His father, Samuel Mitchell, ran a salvage yard on the outskirts of town where broken things arrived to be reborn as something useful. "Nothing's ever truly broken," Samuel would say, elbow-deep in a disassembled tractor engine, just temporarily confused about its purpose. Young Jerry learned to see possibility in wreckage. A cracked radiator became a water basin. Shattered window glass was ground down for chicken grit. Bent steel rebar was heated, hammered, and reformed into tool handles. Every object had value if you were creative enough to find it. The lesson that would eventually save USS Franklin came when Jerry was 12. A neighbor's well pump had failed, and the replacement part would cost more than the family could afford. Samuel took Jerry to the salvage yard and pointed at a pile of seemingly unrelated junk. An old bucket, some rubber hose, a hand crank from a broken grain mill. "What do you see?" Samuel asked. "Garbage," Jerry replied honestly. "Look harder. Don't see what it is. See what it could be." They spent 6 hours in that yard, and by sunset, they'd built a functioning hand pump system using nothing but salvaged parts. It wasn't elegant. It certainly wasn't regulation. But it pulled water from 40 feet down, and it cost exactly $0. "Jerry," his father said as they walked home, "the world is full of people who'll tell you there's only one right way to solve a problem. Usually because that's the only way they know. But the man who can see 10 solutions in a pile of scrap, that man's never truly stuck." School was different. Teachers had textbooks with correct answers. There was one way to solve an equation, one method for each problem. Jerry struggled with the rigidity. His mind saw shortcuts, alternative approaches, creative solutions that worked but weren't proper. "Your son is bright," his 8th-grade teacher told Samuel, "but he refuses to follow instructions. He insists on doing things his own way." Samuel just nodded. "Sounds about right." When Jerry turned 18 in 1941, the world was at war. Harlan County had nothing left to offer but coal mines and poverty. The Navy recruiter who came through town painted a picture of adventure, training, and a steady paycheck. But what sold Jerry was something the recruiter probably didn't even mean to emphasize. "The Navy's got problems nobody's solved yet," the recruiter said. "Ships are getting hit by weapons we've never seen before. Kamikazes. Suicide planes. We're losing sailors because our damage control doctrine was written for a different kind of war." Jerry heard broken things that needed fixing, problems that needed creative solutions, a whole ocean full of machinery that could be improved. He enlisted the next day. Boot camp was an exercise in frustration. "Do it this way. Follow this procedure. By the book, sailor, always by the book." But Jerry noticed something his instructors didn't seem to see. The book was often wrong, or at least incomplete. Damage control drills followed procedures that assumed neat, predictable breaches. Enemy fire that politely created holes the manual had solutions for. Real combat, Jerry suspected, would be messier. They assigned him to damage control training after boot camp, probably because he'd scored well on mechanical aptitude tests. The instructor, a grizzled chief petty officer named Kowalski, taught them collision mats, timber shoring, and emergency patches. All good techniques, all proven, all inadequate, Jerry thought, but didn't say. "Question, Seaman?" Chief Kowalski asked, noticing Jerry's expression. "No, Chief." "Good, because the Navy's been doing damage control since 1775, and if there were a better way, we'd already know about it." Jerry doubted that, but he'd learned when to keep his mouth shut. He'd also learned that sometimes the best way to prove an idea wasn't to argue. It was to build it and let the results speak. He just needed a ship, a problem, and an opportunity. USS Franklin would give him all three. The rumors about USS Franklin started in the replacement barracks at Pearl Harbor. She was called Big Ben officially, but the sailors had other names. Unlucky, Jinxed, the ship that couldn't stay out of trouble. "They're sending you to Franklin?" a torpedo man asked Jerry at the mess hall. "Jesus, man, you pissed somebody off?" Jerry learned the ship's history from a dozen different voices, each adding another layer to the legend. Launched in 1943, she'd already survived multiple kamikaze hits, several bomb strikes, and more close calls than any carrier in the fleet. She'd limped back to port for repairs so many times that crew assignments were considered punishment duty. When Jerry finally saw her at dock in Ulithi Atoll in December 1944, she looked exactly like what she was, a warship held together by welds and determination. Repair crews still swarmed over her flight deck. Fresh steel plating gleamed against weathered gray paint. The smell of acetylene torches filled the air. "Welcome to the unluckiest ship in the Pacific," Fireman Robert Yancey said, appearing beside Jerry at the gangway. "But hey, at least she always makes it back. That's gotta count for something." Yancey became Jerry's guide to life aboard Franklin. The damage control stations, the repair lockers, the unwritten rules that governed 3,600 men living in a floating city of steel. They were assigned to DC Station 4, portside amidships, the most likely place to take a hit, according to the station chief. Jerry spent his first week observing, watching, studying the ship's structure with the same eye his father had taught him to use on salvage. He noticed things. The hull plating along the waterline was thinner than specification, probably thinned by repeated welding and repair. The collision mats in the repair locker were canvas and rope, designed for slow flooding, not catastrophic breaches. The emergency shoring timber was heavy, cumbersome, requiring multiple men and several minutes to deploy. Everything was by the book. Everything followed doctrine. And all of it, Jerry realized, was designed for a different war. A war where ships fought ship, where damage was predictable, where combat followed gentlemen's rules written decades ago. The Kamikaze had changed all that. A suicide plane loaded with explosives created massive, irregular damage, huge breaches below the waterline, flooding rates that overwhelmed standard procedures, ships that went from operational to sinking in minutes. The Navy's answer was more of the same: better collision mats, more pumps, faster response times. All good ideas, all insufficient. Jerry started thinking about pressure dynamics. Water flowed through breaches not just because of ocean pressure, but because the ship's own movement forced it inward. A carrier steaming at 20 knots was essentially ramming seawater through its own wounds. Standard damage control fought the ocean. But what if you could use the ship's momentum against the flooding instead of adding to it? He started sketching ideas during his off-watch hours. Baffle systems, deflector plates, ways to redirect water pressure instead of trying to stop it completely. The physics were simple, almost stupidly simple. But the application would require custom equipment that didn't exist in any supply catalog. "What are you working on?" Yancey asked one night, finding Jerry surrounded by sketches in their berthing compartment. "Alternative breach control method," Jerry replied. "Uses pressure redirection instead of direct sealing." Yancey looked at the drawings. "That a bucket?" "Modified bucket, with rubber gaskets and cable wire for deployment and anchoring. You'd use multiple buckets in an array to create counterflow that—" "Mitchell, we have collision mats for hull breaches, which work great for slow leaks," Jerry said. "But kamikazes don't create slow leaks. They create massive tars that flood compartments in minutes. By the time you've deployed a collision mat, you've already lost the space." Yancey was quiet for a moment. "You planning to pitch this to somebody?" "Maybe, when I've worked out the details." "Word of advice? Officers don't like creative solutions. They like proven procedures. You come at them with buckets and rubber gaskets, they're going to think you're crazy." Jerry thought about his father, about the well pump built from salvage, about every teacher who'd told him there was only one right way to solve a problem. "Then I guess they'll think I'm crazy," he said, and went back to his sketches. He didn't know it yet, but he had less than 3 months to perfect his design. Because on March 19, 1945, USS Franklin would take a kamikaze hit that would give him exactly one chance to prove his crazy idea could work. And if it didn't, 3,000 men would die. The first flooding drill after Jerry's arrival aboard USS Franklin was a disaster. Not a catastrophic failure, more like a slow-motion confirmation of every suspicion he'd developed. The drill simulated a moderate hull breach at frame 68, port side. Standard procedure: deploy collision mat, establish timber shoring, activate emergency pumps. It took the damage control team 12 minutes to get the mat in place. 12 minutes during which, in a real scenario, thousands of gallons would have poured in. The timber shoring required 6 men and barely held against the simulated pressure. The pumps worked fine, but couldn't keep pace with the theoretical flooding rate. "Acceptable response time," Lieutenant Commander Harris announced. "But we need to get that mat deployment down to under 10 minutes. Jerry raised his hand. "Sir, even at 10 minutes, we'd lose the compartment in a real kamikaze scenario." Harris's expression cooled. "You have alternative suggestions, Seaman?" "Yes, sir. A pressure baffle system using modified buckets and—" The laughter started before he could finish. Not cruel laughter exactly, more like the indulgent chuckling you'd give a child who suggested powering the ship with sails. "Buckets," Harris repeated. "You want to fight hull breaches with buckets." "Modified buckets, sir, with rubber gaskets to create seal contact and cable wire for rapid deployment. The system doesn't try to stop the flooding completely. It redirects the pressure flow to reduce volume while pumps handle the—" "Seaman Mitchell," Harris interrupted. "The United States Navy has been perfecting damage control procedures for over a century. If buckets were the solution, someone would have thought of it already. With respect, sir, nobody was facing kamikazes a century ago. The threat profile has changed, but our response hasn't adapted to—" "That's enough." Harris's voice hardened. "We use proven procedures on this ship. Collision mats, timber shoring, equipment that's been tested and validated. We don't experiment with hardware store solutions when lives are at stake. Sir, I could build a prototype, demonstrate the pressure reduction in a controlled—" "Dismissed, Seaman, and stop wasting everyone's time with bucket theories." The meeting broke up with several sailors clapping Jerry on the shoulder, the kind of sympathetic gesture you give someone who'd embarrassed themselves. Yancey pulled him aside afterward. "Man, you really stepped in it," Yancey said. "Harris is old-school Navy, everything by the manual. You're lucky he didn't write you up for insubordination." But Jerry couldn't let it go. The physics were sound. The theory was solid. He just needed to prove it. He started scrounging materials during off hours. A dented bucket from the galley, destined for disposal. Rubber from a damaged Jeep tire in the ship's vehicle bay. Cable wire from the electrical shop's scrap bin. Nothing expensive. Nothing missed. Just salvage, the way his father had taught him. The first prototype took 3 nights to build. He tested it in a storage compartment using a hand pump to simulate water pressure. The results were promising. The bucket reduced flow by approximately 40%. Not perfect, but proof of concept. He built a second prototype, then a third. Each iteration improved the gasket seal, refined the cable wire anchoring system, optimized the deployment mechanism. By the end of January 1945, he had a working system that could be deployed by one person in under 2 minutes. He tried approaching Harris again. The response was worse than before. "Mitchell, I thought I was clear. We don't need your buckets. What we need is for you to focus on your assigned duties and stop playing inventor." "Sir, if you'd just look at the test results—" "I've looked at your record, Seaman. You've got a habit of thinking you're smarter than your superiors. That attitude will get you nowhere in the Navy." Harris leaned forward. "And if I catch you wasting ship's materials on more of these projects, I'll have you on report. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." But Jerry kept building, kept refining. He worked in secret now, using only scrap materials, building during his off-watch hours. Other sailors noticed. "Mitchell's Crazy Bucket Project," they called it. The joke spread through the damage control division. The seaman who thought he could save a carrier with dime store supplies. Even Yancey, who tried to be supportive, expressed doubt. "Look, "I get that you think this works," Yancey said, watching Jerry assemble his sixth prototype. "But even if you're right, what's the point? Harris will never let you use it. Navy procedure is Navy procedure." "Navy procedure changes when reality forces it to," Jerry replied. "Kamikazes forced us to develop better anti-aircraft tactics. Submarines forced us to develop better sonar. And eventually, hull breaches are going to force us to develop better damage control." "Yeah? And when's that going to happen?" Jerry didn't answer. He didn't know. He just kept building, kept improving, kept preparing for an opportunity that might never come. By mid-March, he had 6 complete bucket assemblies hidden in his locker, each one capable of handling breaches up to 20 feet, each one deployable in under 3 minutes, each one representing a solution that nobody wanted to hear about. And then, at 7:07 a.m., on March 19, 1945, a Japanese Zero carrying a 550-pound bomb turned Jerry's ridicule into the only hope USS Franklin had left. Sometimes vindication comes with a price tag written in fire and seawater. March 19, 1945 started like every other morning aboard USS Franklin. Reveille at 0530. Breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like diesel fuel. Flight operations commencing at 0630 as the carrier steamed toward the Japanese mainland, 50 miles off the coast of Kyushu. Jerry pulled watch at DC Station 4 at 0600, relieving the night crew. The morning was clear, with good visibility, perfect flying weather. On the flight deck above, crews were preparing aircraft for the day's strike missions. F-4U Corsairs, SB-2C Helldivers, TBM Avengers, the familiar choreography of a carrier at war. "Quiet morning," Yancey commented, settling into position beside Jerry. "Maybe our luck's changing." Jerry didn't believe in luck. He believed in preparation, probability, and the certainty that operating 50 miles from Japan meant enemy contact was inevitable. He ran through his mental checklist. Collision mats, stowed and ready. Timber shoring, staged at access points. Emergency pumps, tested and operational. And hidden in his locker at frame 85, 6 bucket assemblies that officially didn't exist. At 0707, the Combat Air Patrol reported an unidentified aircraft approaching from the northwest. Then another. Then the general quarters alarm shattered the morning routine. Jerry was already moving toward his battle station when the sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Through the ship's passageways, he could hear the thunder of 5-inch guns, the staccato hammering of 40mm Bofors, the desperate chatter of 20mm cannons. The cap had missed someone who'd gotten through. The explosion came at 7:07 and 13 seconds. Not a surface impact. Deeper. The entire ship shuddered like a living thing in mortal pain. Jerry felt it through the deck plates, the distinctive double impact of a bomb penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay. The worst-case scenario. Dozens of fully fueled and armed aircraft packed together in an enclosed space. And now there was a bomb blast in the middle of them. Secondary explosions followed immediately. Aviation fuel igniting. Ordnance cooking off. Torpedoes, rockets, ammunition. The hangar bay became a crematorium. The ship's phone screamed to life. DC Central to all stations. Massive casualties in the hangar bay. Fire and flooding on multiple decks. All damage control parties respond. Then came the call Jerry had been unconsciously dreading for 3 months. Hull breach, port side, frames 70 through 88. Flooding in engineering spaces. Breach estimated at 15 to 20 feet. The exact scenario his bucket system was designed for. Harris's voice cut through the chaos on the command circuit. "DC teams to frame 80. Port side. Break out collision mats and shoring. Move!" Jerry and Yancey ran. Through passageways filling with smoke. Past wounded sailors being carried towards sick bay. The ship listed to port. Maybe 3 degrees, maybe more. Impossible to tell while running. They reached frame 80 to find a nightmare. Water was pouring through a massive irregular gash in the hull plating. Not flowing, pouring. The force of it had already knocked 2 sailors off their feet. The compartment was knee-deep and rising fast. A chief petty officer Jerry didn't recognize was trying to organize a collision mat deployment. "Get that mat over the—" An explosion from somewhere above cut off his words. The hangar bay, still cooking off ammunition. Jerry assessed the breach with a practiced eye. 18 feet long, irregular edges. Massive water flow amplified by the ship's forward speed. A collision mat would take 8 minutes minimum to deploy. The compartment would be fully flooded in 6. "Fall back to frame 95, someone shouted. "We're losing this section." Standard procedure when a compartment couldn't be saved. Establish a new watertight boundary further in. Sacrifice this space to save the rest. Accept the loss. Except the engineering spaces were 1 deck down. And there were men down there. Men who couldn't evacuate if this compartment flooded and sealed above them. Jerry made a decision that would either save the ship or end his naval career. "Yancey, my locker at frame 85. Grab the bucket assemblies. All of them." "The what?" "The stupid buckets everyone laughed at. Move!" While Yancey ran, Jerry waded toward the breach. The water was rising to his waist now, freezing cold, filled with debris. The ship shuddered with another secondary explosion. The list increased. 5 degrees now, maybe 6. Yancey returned with 3 bucket assemblies, struggling under the weight. "Mitchell, what the hell are you—" "Doing my job," Jerry interrupted. "Deploy these at intervals along the breach. Rubber gasket against the hull. Cable wire to the support stanchions. Move!" They had maybe 3 minutes before the compartment was lost. 3 minutes to prove that 3 months of ridicule had been preparation for this exact moment. 3 minutes to demonstrate that sometimes the solution nobody wants to hear about is the solution everyone needs. Jerry deployed the first bucket at 0712 and watched water flow decrease by 1/3. At 0714, the ship's survival stopped being theoretical and became a matter of buckets, rubber, and 1 sailor's refusal to accept that the manual had all the answers. USS Franklin had 2,800 men still alive. The number was dropping every second. But now, incredibly, it was dropping slower. The first bucket locked into place, and Jerry felt the change through the water itself. The violent torrent pouring through the hull breach didn't stop, but it shivered. The rubber gasket, compressed against the torn steel by thousands of pounds of water pressure, created a deflection point. The ocean was still winning, but now it was fighting on 2 fronts: inward pressure from outside and redirection from inside. "Second bucket!" Jerry shouted to Yancey. 4 feet down from the first one, same angle. Yancey was moving on instinct now, past questioning, past doubt. He deployed the second bucket assembly while Jerry worked on the third. The cable wire system, salvaged from electrical scrap and reinforced with knots his father had taught him, held against the strain. Each bucket didn't seal the breach. Instead, they created a cascade effect, each deflection feeding into the next, turning chaotic flooding into something approaching manageable flow. The water level in the compartment stopped rising. Not dropping, the pumps would handle that part, but no longer climbing toward the overhead. The impossible was happening in real time. Lieutenant Commander Harris appeared through the smoke and steam like an avenging angel. His face was blackened with soot, his khakis torn and soaked. He stopped when he saw the bucket array, his expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been respect. "Mitchell!" His voice was barely audible over the groaning metal and distant explosions. "Is that what I think it is?" "Pressure baffle system, sir," Jerry replied, deploying the fourth bucket. "Reduces flow by redirecting ship's momentum instead of fighting ocean pressure head-on. Estimated 70% reduction in flooding rate. Harris stared at the buckets, holding back the Pacific Ocean. A chief damage control officer with 20 years of service, watching everything he knew about hull breach response get rewritten by a seaman with 75 cents worth of materials. "Can you replicate this?" Harris asked. "Already have, sir. 6 complete assemblies. I can teach any DC team to deploy them in under 5 minutes." "Do it!" Harris grabbed the ship's phone. "DC Central, this is Harris. I need runners to every damage control station. Emergency training protocol for new breach control equipment." He paused, looking at Jerry. "What do you call this system?" Jerry hadn't thought of a name. "Mitchell Pressure Baffle Assembly? We'll work on the name later. Right now, get me 3 sailors who can learn this fast." Within 15 minutes, Jerry was teaching damage control technique that didn't exist in any manual. The ship shuddered continuously with secondary explosions from the hangar bay above. The casualty reports coming over the command circuit were catastrophic. Hundreds dead, hundreds more wounded, fires out of control on 3 decks. But the flooding was becoming survivable. A team deployed bucket assemblies at a smaller breach near frame 95. Another team tackled flooding in the forward sections. The technique spread through the ship like wildfire, passed from sailor to sailor, each deployment proving that the stupid bucket idea was the innovation nobody knew they needed. At 0745, the engineering officer, Commander Patterson, arrived at frame 80. He was the senior engineer aboard, a by-the-book officer who'd once told Jerry that unauthorized modifications were a symptom of poor discipline. He looked at the bucket array, looked at Jerry, looked at the water level that should have been ceiling high by now. "Seaman Mitchell?" Patterson's voice was carefully neutral. "Yes, sir? You're either going to get a medal for this, or I'm going to personally throw you in the brig for unauthorized modification of damage control procedures." He paused. "But that decision comes after we survive. Right now, I need you in DC Central. The captain wants to talk to you." The walk to DC Central took Jerry through a ship transformed into hell. Bodies covered with blankets. Wounded sailors being triaged in passageways. Fire teams battling blazes with inadequate equipment. The smell of burning fuel and flesh mixing with seawater and smoke. DC Central was controlled chaos. Damage control boards showed red lights across multiple sections. Captain Leslie Garres stood at the center, a granite-faced officer making impossible decisions about which parts of his ship to save and which to abandon. He looked up when Jerry entered. "You're Mitchell?" "Yes, sir. Harris tells me you've invented a new damage control technique using buckets and rubber gaskets. Says it's the only reason we're still afloat." "The system redirects pressure dynamics, sir. It's not a complete solution, but it reduces flooding rates enough for pumps to—" "I don't need the technical explanation, son. I need to know if you can keep this ship from sinking for the next 6 hours while we get fires under control." Jerry thought about the bucket assemblies deployed across the ship, thought about the breaches still flooding, the fires still burning, the ammunition still cooking off. Thought about his father's voice. "Nothing's ever truly broken, just temporarily confused about its purpose." "Yes, sir," Jerry said. "We can keep her afloat." Captain Garres nodded once. "Then get back to work, seaman. And Mitchell, whatever happens today, you saved lives. Remember that." Jerry returned to frame 80 to find Yancey supervising 2 new sailors in deploying additional buckets. The flooding was under control. Not stopped, not solved, but controlled. And sometimes in war, control is all you need to survive until tomorrow. The battle to save USS Franklin lasted 7 hours and 14 minutes. Jerry would remember every second. By 0800, bucket assemblies were deployed at 9 different breach points throughout the ship. The flooding rates had stabilized. Not ideal, the ship still listed 7 degrees to port, pumps running continuously, but survivable. The immediate crisis had shifted from "we're sinking" to "we might make it if nothing else goes wrong." Everything else went wrong. At 0823, a massive secondary explosion in the hangar bay sent a fireball through 3 decks. The blast killed 12 firefighters and ignited fuel stores everyone thought had been secured. At 0907, an ammunition locker cooked off, killing 8 more sailors and blowing a hole in the starboard side that required another emergency bucket deployment. Jerry moved through the ship like a ghost, appearing wherever bucket systems needed adjustment or new deployments were required. His hands were raw from cable wire. His uniform was soaked with seawater and blood, some his, most belonging to wounded sailors he'd helped evacuate. Time became meaningless, measured only in crises managed and disasters averted. At 10:15, he was at frame 110 teaching a repair party how to reinforce a failing bucket array when Yancey found him. "Mitchell, we've got a problem." Yancey's face was grim. "Frame 72, port side. One of your bucket assemblies is failing. The rubber gasket's tearing from the pressure." Jerry felt his stomach drop. He'd tested the gaskets, but never under sustained pressure for multiple hours. The rubber was salvaged, not new. It had limits. They reached frame 72 to find water flow increasing through a breach that had been controlled for 2 hours. The gasket on the primary bucket was visibly degrading, splitting along stress points. In maybe 10 minutes, it would fail completely, and the flooding would return to catastrophic rates. "We need replacement gaskets," Jerry said. "There's more rubber in the vehicle bay, but it'll take 30 minutes to fabricate and deploy." "We don't have 30 minutes, a petty officer replied. "Captains ordered this section sealed if flooding can't be controlled. There are fuel lines 1 deck down. If they rupture from water pressure, they'll feed the fires in the hangar bay," Jerry finished. "Yeah, I know." He studied the failing gasket, his mind racing through options. Standard damage control said seal the section and accept the loss. His bucket system was failing. Proof, maybe, that Harris had been right to dismiss it as an unreliable field modification. Then Jerry remembered his father's other lesson. When one solution fails, you adapt. "Yancey, get me every leather belt you can find. Uniform belts, equipment straps, anything leather. And find me the ship's cobbler. There's got to be someone aboard who works with leather." "What are you thinking? Leather's more durable than rubber under sustained pressure. We can't replace the gasket, but we can reinforce it. Create a secondary seal that distributes the stress." It was insane. It was desperate. It was also the only option that didn't involve giving up. They had 11 belts within 8 minutes. A ship's serviceman named Torres appeared with a leather working kit. Jerry directed them to wrap the belts around the failing gasket in overlapping layers, creating a reinforced barrier that would, theoretically, hold long enough for the rubber to be replaced. "This is the craziest thing I've ever seen," Torres muttered. "Stitching leather underwater. And I once saw a guy try to put out a fire with coffee." The repair took 14 minutes. When they finished, the water flow had stabilized again. Not perfect, not permanent, but holding. At 11:47, the fires in the hangar bay were finally brought under control. At 13:02, the last secondary explosion rippled through the ship, smaller this time, manageable. By 1400, casualty counts were stabilizing. The bleeding had stopped. USS Franklin would survive. At 1428, Jerry was sitting against a bulkhead in an evacuated compartment, too exhausted to move, when Captain Garris found him. The captain looked like he'd aged a decade in 7 hours. "Mitchell," Garris said quietly, "final count is 724 dead, 265 wounded. Worst casualties any carrier has ever taken and remained afloat." Jerry nodded, too numb to respond. "Engineering estimates your bucket systems reduced flooding by 70 to 80%, Garris continued. "Without them, we'd have lost buoyancy and capsized within an hour. That's 2,800 men who'd be dead instead of alive right now. Sir, the gaskets are failing. The system isn't. The system saved my ship, seaman. It's not perfect, but it worked when nothing else could. Garrus paused. You broke about 15 regulations building and deploying unauthorized equipment. Under normal circumstances, I'd have you court-martialed. Jerry waited for the other shoe to drop. But these aren't normal circumstances, Garrus said. And I'm not interested in punishing the man who saved USS Franklin. I'm interested in making sure every ship in the fleet has access to what you built. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to write up complete technical specifications for your bucket system. Then you're going to teach it to every damage control officer in the Pacific Fleet. Understood? Yes, sir. Garrus started to leave, then turned back. One more thing, Mitchell. What you did today, that wasn't just damage control. That was courage. The kind of courage that doesn't come from following orders. It comes from knowing when the orders aren't enough, and having the guts to do what's right anyway. 7 hours of hell, 724 dead. One ship saved by buckets and brilliance, and a sailor who refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. USS Franklin limped into Pearl Harbor on April 3, 1945, under her own power, a feat naval historians would later call miraculous. The sight of her drew crowds to the harbor. A carrier that should have sunk, kept afloat by pumps, prayers, and pressure baffles built from salvaged materials. Jerry stood on deck as they made port, watching the gathered crowd, feeling nothing but exhaustion. He'd been awake for most of the 2-week journey, maintaining bucket systems that continued to hold against slow flooding. His hands were bandaged. His face was hollow. He'd lost 14 pounds he didn't have to spare. What he didn't know was that his immediate future was being decided in a Pearl Harbor conference room where naval officers debated whether he was a hero or a problem. Captain Garrus presented one view. Seaman Mitchell saved this ship and 2,800 men with ingenuity and courage. He deserves commendation. A captain from the Bureau of Ships presented another. Seaman Mitchell violated weapons and equipment protocols, used unauthorized materials, and deployed untested systems without proper approval. In any other context, that's court-martial territory. Commander Patterson, Franklin's engineering officer, added complexity. His system works. I've run the numbers. Pressure baffle dynamics are sound. But it's built from salvaged materials with no quality control, no standardization, no testing protocol. We can't just roll this out fleet-wide without proper engineering review. The debate continued for 3 days while Jerry waited in limbo, sleeping in a barracks and wondering if he'd saved a ship only to face prosecution for how he'd done it. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz reviewed the reports, consulted with engineering experts, and issued a directive that threaded the needle between recognition and regulation. Seaman Gerald Mitchell demonstrated exceptional initiative and technical skill in developing damage control innovations under combat conditions. His actions saved USS Franklin and are to be commended. However, deployment of unauthorized equipment violated established protocols and cannot be condoned without review. Therefore, Seaman Mitchell is hereby awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. Simultaneously, his pressure baffle system will be subject to formal engineering evaluation by the Bureau of Ships. If validated, the system will be standardized, tested, and incorporated into fleet damage control doctrine. Seaman Mitchell will participate in this development process. No disciplinary action will be taken, provided he submits all future innovations through proper channels. Translation: You're a hero, but don't do it again without permission. The medal ceremony was quiet, attended mostly by Franklin survivors who knew what Jerry's buckets had meant. Yancey was there, promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class. Torres, the ship's serviceman who'd helped with the leather belt repair. A dozen others who'd deployed bucket assemblies or been saved by them. Admiral Nimitz pinned the medal on Jerry's dress uniform and spoke quietly enough that only Jerry could hear. "Son, the Navy runs on procedures for good reason. But procedures only work when someone's smart enough to know when they're insufficient. You had that wisdom. Just try to work within the system next time. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The aftermath was surreal. Jerry spent 6 weeks at Pearl Harbor working with naval engineers to formalize his bucket system. They refined his design, standardized the components, developed proper gasket materials that wouldn't fail under sustained pressure. What had been a desperate field modification became the emergency pressure baffle system. Official, tested, approved. By July 1945, every carrier and capital ship in the Pacific Fleet carried EPBS equipment. Damage control teams trained on deployment procedures. The system that had been mocked as Mitchell's stupid buckets was now required equipment. Jerry received letters from sailors he'd never met, thanking him for an innovation that had saved their ships. A destroyer off Okinawa took a kamikaze hit and deployed bucket baffles that kept her afloat. A cruiser used the system after a torpedo strike. Each success validated what Jerry had known in his gut. The solution nobody wanted to hear about had become the solution everyone needed. But recognition came with complexity. Some officers resented that a seaman had shown them a better way. Others questioned whether proper engineering review might have developed something superior if given time. The Bureau of Ships took credit for refining and improving the system, barely mentioning Jerry's original design. In August, after Japan surrendered, Jerry received orders transferring him to the Naval Postgraduate School for formal engineering training, the Navy's way of channeling his innovative mind into approved pathways. It was an honor. It was also a leash. Yancey found him the night before he shipped out. "You did good, Mitchell. You know that, right? All those guys who laughed at your buckets. They're alive because you didn't listen." "I just solved a problem," Jerry replied. "No," Yancey said. "You did more than that. You proved that sometimes the best ideas come from people nobody's listening to. The trick is having the guts to prove them right anyway." Jerry thought about that as his transport left Pearl Harbor, about his father's salvage yard, about being told there was only one right way to solve problems, about a war that had forced him to choose between following rules and saving lives. He'd made his choice, and somehow, improbably, both the Navy and the men of USS Franklin had decided he'd chosen correctly. Medal or court-martial? In the end, he'd gotten both. Recognition for courage and a reminder that innovation without permission always carries a price. He just hoped the price was worth what it had purchased. 60 years after USS Franklin limped into Pearl Harbor, a museum curator at the Naval Academy in Annapolis carefully placed an artifact behind glass. A dented steel bucket with a deteriorated rubber gasket and lengths of cable wire still attached. The plaque read, "Emergency Pressure Baffle System, Prototype, developed by Seaman Gerald Mitchell, USS Franklin, CV-13, March 1945. This improvised damage control device saved 2,800 lives and revolutionized naval engineering doctrine." Gerald Mitchell stood before that display case in 2005, now 82 years old, leaning on a cane, his hands still bearing scars from cable wire 60 years gone. He'd been invited to speak at the Naval Academy's Damage Control Symposium, an annual event that, ironically, had been established partially because of innovations he'd pioneered. "I didn't revolutionize anything," Jerry told the assembled midshipmen. "I just refused to accept that men should die because our procedures weren't keeping up with the threats we faced." The statistics told a different story. After the emergency pressure baffle system was standardized in 1945, U.S. Navy ships showed a 64% improvement in surviving catastrophic hull breaches. During the Korean War, 3 ships deployed EPBS equipment after mine or torpedo damage and remained operational. During peacetime, the Coast Guard adopted modified versions for civilian rescue operations. By the 1960s, Jerry's basic concept, using pressure redirection instead of direct sealing, had influenced damage control doctrine across every naval service in NATO. Engineering textbooks taught Mitchell dynamics as fundamental principles. What had started as a desperate improvisation with salvaged materials had become foundational knowledge. But the human story was more complex. Jerry never saw combat again after Franklin. The Navy sent him through engineering school, gave him a commission, assigned him to Bureau of Ships, where he worked on damage control innovation for 15 years. He retired as a lieutenant commander in 1963, having contributed to dozens of projects, most of which went uncredited. He married a nurse he'd met at Pearl Harbor, Mary Chen, who'd treated Franklin survivors and understood what it meant to improvise solutions in crisis. They had 3 children, all of whom heard the bucket story so many times they could recite it verbatim. For decades, Jerry's contribution remained known mainly within naval engineering circles. Franklin's survival was attributed to heroic damage control efforts, with little specific mention of whose innovation had made those efforts successful. Jerry didn't fight for recognition. He'd solved a problem. Men had lived. That was enough. But in 1999, a naval historian named Dr. Rebecca Torres, granddaughter of the ship's serviceman who'd helped repair failing gaskets, began researching Franklin's survival. She discovered Jerry's original design sketches in archived materials. She interviewed survivors. She documented how a seaman's stupid bucket idea had been systematically credited to official Navy engineering efforts. Her book, Salvage and Survival: The Untold Innovations of World War II, dedicated 3 chapters to Jerry's story. It reignited interest in his contribution and led to the Naval Academy invitation. Standing before those midshipmen in 2005, Jerry was asked the question he'd heard 100 times. "Sir, what made you think you could solve a problem that trained engineers hadn't?" He thought about his father's salvage yard, about being told there was only one right way, about 3 months of ridicule and 7 hours of vindication. "I didn't think I was smarter than trained engineers," Jerry replied. "I just had a different perspective. I grew up in poverty, where you learn to see solutions in what other people called garbage. The Navy taught me procedures, which are valuable. But my father taught me something more valuable. Problems don't care about your credentials. They only care whether your solution works." He paused, looking at the bucket behind glass. "The men who laughed at my buckets weren't wrong to be skeptical. Skepticism is healthy in engineering. But skepticism becomes obstruction when it prevents you from testing ideas that might save lives. The trick is knowing when to follow proven procedures and when to risk trying something new." A midshipman asked, "Sir, would you do it the same way again? Or would you go through proper channels first?" Jerry smiled. "If I had time, I'd go through proper channels. Engineering review is important. Testing is important. But on March 19, 1945, I didn't have time. I had minutes, and in those minutes, I had to choose between following procedure and saving lives." He met the midshipman's eyes. "In combat, being right is more important than being authorized. Just be prepared to prove you were right afterward." The symposium ended with a demonstration of modern pressure baffle systems, sophisticated descendants of Jerry's bucket design, built with advanced materials and computer-optimized deployment mechanisms. They looked nothing like the crude assemblies he'd built from salvage, but the physics were identical. After the event, Yancey found him, both of them old men now, Franklin survivors who'd stayed in touch across 60 years. They stood together before the bucket display. "You ever regret it?" Yancey asked. All the grief you got for not following procedure? Jerry thought about the 1,800 men who'd survived Franklin, about the ships saved in later years using principles he'd pioneered, about the children and grandchildren of sailors who existed because his buckets had worked. "No," he said simply, "I don't regret it." When Gerald Mitchell died in 2009 at age 86, his obituary in the Navy Times called him the sailor who saved an aircraft carrier with buckets and brilliance. The Naval Academy requested permission to display his Navy and Marine Corps medal alongside the original bucket. Mary agreed, with one condition: that the display include his father's words, which Jerry had carried through life. The updated plaque now reads, "Emergency Pressure Baffle System, Prototype, developed by Seaman Gerald Mitchell, USS Franklin, CV-13, March 1945. Nothing's ever truly broken, just temporarily confused about its purpose. This improvised device saved 2,800 lives and proved that innovation often comes from those willing to see solutions where others see only problems." Every damage control officer at the Naval Academy passes that display during training. Most pause to read the story. Some understand immediately what it means. Others take years to grasp the deeper lesson. That courage isn't just about facing the enemy. Sometimes it's about facing your own chain of command and saying, "I know a better way." That expertise matters, but perspective matters more. That the difference between a stupid idea and a brilliant innovation is often just whether you have the guts to prove it works. And that sometimes, just sometimes, 75 cents worth of materials and a refusal to accept the impossible can change the course of history. USS Franklin survived the war, was decommissioned in 1947, and scrapped in 1966. But her legacy lives in every damage control procedure, every emergency innovation, every sailor who looks at a crisis and thinks, "There has to be a better way, and I'm going to find it." Gerald Mitchell didn't set out to revolutionize naval engineering. He just set out to save his ship with whatever materials he had available. It's a small distinction, but it made all the difference.